This is Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. I'm going to show you a quick clip now.
On the night of July 22nd, 1991, Milwaukee police finally discovered the horrendous secrets that Jeffrey Dahmer had been desperately hiding for many years. Acting on a tip from a young gay man who escaped from Dahmer's apartment, police searched number 213 and found a chamber of unimaginable horrors. Human heads and a heart wrapped and bagged in the freezer. Hands and feet at the bottom of his soup kettle. Skulls tucked away in a file cabinet. And this blue barrel stuffed with dismembered torsos soaking in acid. Dahmer would spend the next 24 hours confessing, telling in vivid detail of a murder spree that began in 1978 when he was 18 and ended with 17 young men dead.
I had this reoccurring fantasy of meeting a hitchhiker on the road and of taking him hostage and doing what I wanted with him. And I never in my wildest nightmares thought that it would become a reality.
Why would Dahmer have, as he put it, created his own Holocaust? How did he become so filled with evil? It would be comforting to point to an abusive childhood, an early life filled with hatred or horror, but his was filled with love.
Jeff was the most beautiful, darling, sweetest baby, the nicest young boy.
There just were no real signs when he was growing up.
Jeffrey Dahmer. He killed men that he found attractive. The last 5 victims died while he was trying to create a living zombie. He wanted to destroy a person's will to have a completely compliant lover. Killing was a means to an end. He just wanted to keep them and remove their ability to leave him. He said that he wanted to be studied so that these horrors could be prevented from happening again. He photographed the bodies of his victims at various stages of the killing, often posing them in odd positions. He collected specific parts of his victims, usually the head and genitals, to keep as souvenirs. He was building a shrine out of his victims' bones to use as a kind of altar. Towards the end of his killing spree, he began to eat parts of his victims as a way of keeping them with him. He was happy and outgoing till about the age of 5, when he became withdrawn, lethargic and unhappy. The family moved in 1966 for his father's work, and his mother suffered with anxiety and depression. Some say that he was neglected as a child. However, he and his parents say that his childhood was fairly normal. Dahmer collected animal remains and experimented with them.
In biology class we had the usual dissection of fetal pigs, and I took the remains of that home and kept the skeleton of it, and I just started branching out. Dogs, cats. I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy, but it didn't. It veered off into this. I wanted to see what the insides of these animals looked like. There may have been some violence involved, some underlying subconscious feelings of violence. It was a compulsion.
When Jeff reached puberty, he started experiencing same-sex attractions. He did not feel that he could share this with his family or friends, so kept his sexuality a secret.
We talked about superficial things. Never really had a real deep heart-to-heart talk about what was going on inside our own minds.
Why do you think that was?
Because from about 15 years on up, a great deal of my thoughts were basically unshareable.
As a teenager, there were many things Jeffrey felt he couldn't share with his parents. But in Lionel Dahmer's home, one subject was particularly taboo.
Did you ever consider talking to your parents, to your dad, about homosexuality? Is that something that
No,
you felt you could ever
because
raise?
early on, I really didn't know that much about it myself. All I knew was that it was something that was to be kept hush-hush, not talked about, not even thought about. So I just kept it all within me and never talked about sexual issues at all, really, with anybody.
If Jeff had come to you and said, "Dad, I'm a homosexual," how would you have reacted?
I think I would have started in on a program to try to change his thinking.
So you would not have been accepting?
No, no.
Do you believe to this day that he is, as a homosexual, living in a state of sin?
If you believe the inspired word of God, which I do, that is sin. It's repugnant to God.
Do you think Jeff was ashamed of his homosexuality?
I think so.
He certainly
think
hid it
so.
from you.
Mm-hmm. He sure did.
At school, Jeff was a loner. His social awkwardness made it difficult for him to make friends. In an attempt to gain popularity, Jeff became somewhat of a class clown by pretending to have epileptic seizures or cerebral palsy, knocking things over and bumping into people, which helped him form a small group of friends. Jeff struggled to deal with the breakdown of his parents' marriage, a relationship that became so volatile and bitter that knives were drawn. He began drinking heavily, sneaking alcohol into school, and drinking all day, every day. He then began to distance himself from his friends, spending more and more time dismembering and dissolving animal remains. His parents divorced in his senior year, and Lionel moved out of the family home into a nearby motel. Just before Jeff's graduation, Joyce moved out with a youngest son, David. Dahmer was left at home on his own, feeling utterly rejected and abandoned. His first murder was 3 weeks after graduation. Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker, 19-year-old Stephen Hicks. He convinced Hicks to come back to his house and drink alcohol with him. When Hicks wanted to leave, Dahmer got angry. He hit Hicks on the back of the head twice with a dumbbell, then strangled him to death. He stripped the body naked and masturbated as he stood above it. The next day, he took the body under the house and dissected it. After the body had been under the house for a few weeks, he removed all of the soft tissue, dissolving it in acid. He then smashed the bones into small fragments with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woodland surrounding his house. 6 weeks after the murder, Lionel returned home with his new fiancée, finding his alcoholic son home alone. Lionel sent Jeff off to university, but he only attended for a few months. Lionel, now rapidly losing hope for his son's future, convinced Jeff to join the US Army in 1979. After two and a half years as a combat medic, he was discharged because of his alcohol addiction. After a short time living in Florida, he went to live with his grandmother in Milwaukee. In 1982, he was arrested for exposing himself to a crowd of 25 women and children. In 1985, he got a job working nights in a chocolate factory. Later that year, Jeffrey started having sexual encounters with men he met at gay bars and bathhouses. He found it increasingly frustrating when his sexual partners moved during sex, and he did not like being penetrated with another man's penis. In 1986, he started to spike his partner's drinks with sleeping pills so he could rape their unconscious bodies. Once word got around about this, he was banned from many of the gay bars and bathhouses. In 1987, Dahmer took Steve Toomey back to his hotel room with the intention of drugging and raping him. He claims to have no memory of beating Toomey to death. He smuggled the body out of the hotel in a suitcase and took it back to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered the body and disposed of it in much the same way as he had disposed of Hicks's body 9 years earlier. Except this time, he attempted to preserve and keep the skull for masturbation purposes. But the boiling and bleaching of the skull had made it too brittle, so he pulverized and disposed of it. After killing Toomey, Dahmer gave into his urges and began to actively seek victims, often offering them cash to take nude photos of them at his apartment. He compulsively killed and disposed of his next 15 victims in much the same way as the first two. Okay, so let's look at some approaches After Jeff was killed in prison, his mother had his brain analysed because his father implied that at least some of Jeff's behaviour was due to the medication she was taking while she was pregnant. The autopsy revealed no brain abnormalities. Jeff displayed many traits of Asperger's syndrome. He systematically killed his victims in a repetitive fashion. He had narrow specific interests. He had difficulty with social situations. He had above average intelligence, and he had a formal way of speaking. Attachment theory would say, Erickson said, that the mother's feeding practice influences the strength of her infant's attachment. Joyce found breastfeeding exhausting and irritating. Rejecting inconsistent or emotionally unavailable parents could have contributed to feelings of mistrust and insecurity in Jeff. Failure to develop trust will have resulted in fear and a belief that the world is inconsistent and unpredictable, which could be why Jeff wanted complete control of his victims, so that they couldn't leave him. Mary Ainsworth's attachment theory outlines different attachment styles. Resistant attachment comes from inconsistent parenting, either reacting too enthusiastically or indifferently to Jeff, depending on mood, creating a clingy child that can become angry or resentful when emotional support is not given. Disorganized, disorientated attachment, Joyce may have neglected Jeff due to her anxiety and depression, which will have caused him to be drawn to her, yet to mistrust her. Psychodynamic approach, Jeff may have had a dominant id and a weak superego. The superego develops at around age 5 when moral principles are internalized. This is also the age where he started to show signs of social difficulties. Having a weak superego will have made it difficult for him to control his impulses. The oral stage, as a result of not being breastfed, Jeff may have had too little oral gratification, which can result in a fixation, possibly leading a person to smoke, drink too much alcohol, or in this case, maybe even eat parts of people. Confusion at the phallic stage, when Jeff's pleasure zone switched to his genitals. He may have had mixed Oedipus-Electra complex, where he had unconscious sexual desires for his father and feared the loss of affection from his mother, which added to his sexual confusion and deviances. Alfred Adler's inferiority complex theory may explain some of Jeff's feelings at school, where for a long time he had no friends. He struggled to fit in, which led him to feel helpless, hopeless, and unmotivated. According to Erickson's new ego theory, the ego is much more than just the mediator of the id and superego. Its job is to establish and maintain a sense of identity. When Jeff was in school, he was lacking direction and suffering an identity crisis, which may have exacerbated his drinking and his tendency to make a fool of himself, creating a vicious circle. In prison, Jeff was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, identity disturbance being a primary feature of this. Erickson's industry versus inferiority stage from age 6 may explain why Jeff threw himself into collecting and preserving animal remains, which gave him a sense of purpose. His father reinforced this behavior as he thought that Jeff was taking an interest in science. Social learning theory. During his final killing spree, when he started to make a shrine in his flat, Dahmer was obsessed with watching certain scenes from The Exorcist III and The Return of the Jedi. He would often watch them with his victims as the sedatives were beginning to take effect. He specifically identified with the Emperor from Star Wars and the Gemini Killer from The Exorcist, a character who was possessed by Satan. Both of these characters were evil and had obscene amounts of power, enabling them to dominate and control people. Both characters had yellow eyes, and Jeff bought yellow eye contact lenses, which he wore when he went out on the prowl for a new victim. This is Jeff's drawing of his shrine over here on the right. And the cognitive approach might say that Jeff had many fantasies of luring men somewhere, knocking them out, and raping them, creating a cognitive framework for his actions. His adolescent sexual fantasies were mixed up with the dissection of animals and a desire to control, as his schemas about sex formed. Dahmer had specific rituals before he killed. He would drink alcohol, limiting his executive function and lowering his inhibitions, giving him the courage to kill. He watched parts of films featuring his favourite characters committing evil deeds to get himself into the right mindset. Why did it happen? Well, of course, many people experience the same things in life as Jeffrey Dahmer did, and they may also be born with Asperger's or other similar neurological conditions, but still not become serial killers. However, for him, it was a series of unfortunate events, his circumstances, his emotional disposition, repressing his sexuality, his alcoholism, and neurological structure that led to his first impulse killing, then the unintended killing of his second victim. His belief that he was uncatchable set him on a path of destruction. Well, yeah, not much we could do really. I mean, the only thing that we might be able to do is monitor children's mental health more closely, improved access to nurture groups for children that do present emotional difficulties, and society needs to adjust so that parents, teachers in general do not force a child to act against their own sexual orientations, allow them to express themselves accordingly.